evening. It means they close the show, dumbbell.
Here, give me that costume.
I beg your pardon.
Well, we gotta take it back, actress.
Well, that's as far back as it goes.
Hello everyone, welcome to my video essay. Today I'll be doing a film analysis and discussing a particular film and its themes. Given a choice between any American-made movie musical I wanted to research, I chose the Depression-era comedy-drama musical Gold Diggers of 1933. I chose this film for two main reasons. Number one, it is a film that was released within the Great Depression, which I found interesting, and number two, it is a pre-code film. Pre-code meaning it was released 1 year before the Hays Code was issued in 1934. The Hays Code was a set of self-imposed guidelines for Hollywood that dealt with censorship of things like profanity and nudity. That being said, some of the themes and topics within the film that I will talk about might seem a bit scandalous for the time. Let's begin with a quick synopsis of the film. Directed by Mervyn LeRoy and Busby Berkeley and set in 1933 on Broadway, things get tough for Carol and her showgirl pals Polly, Trixie, and Faye when the Great Depression kicks in and all the Broadway shows close down. Wealthy songwriter Brad saves the day by funding a new Depression-themed musical for the girls to star in, but when his stuffy high society brother finds out and threatens to disown Brad, Carol and her gold-digging friends scheme to keep the show going, hooking a couple millionaires along the way. I feel it's also important to note that the story is based on the play The Gold Diggers by Avery Hopwood, which ran on Broadway 717 times from 1919 to 1920. There were a few films made between 1920 and 1933 that also used this storyline with slight changes. This now brings me to the focus of my research and my thesis statement. Busby Berkeley and Mervyn LeRoy's pre-code comedy musical Gold Diggers of 1933 was revolutionary as it intersects class and gender within the spatial and temporal context of a country ravished by a continuing depression. Released in 1933, Berkeley and LeRoy gave new perspectives to Depression-era sentiments through their combination of music, comedy, and drama. Released before the implementation of the Hays Code, Berkeley and LeRoy depict a close interpretation of romance and class within the 1930s American landscape and the sentiments of the American people during the time. In this video essay, I will be exploring the intersection of class, gender, and romance within the frame of a society going through economic hardship. How did the Great Depression affect depictions of class, gender, romance? Why do moments of economic or political turmoil affect tone, and how does the film choose to situate itself and its tone? Through the exploration of character tropes, musical numbers, tone, themes, dialogue, and plot, I intend on answering these questions and learning more about potential themes within Depression-era filmmaking. In this video essay, I will be exploring as to why Busby Berkeley and Mervyn LeRoy's depictions of class, gender, and romance in Gold Diggers of 1933 are inextricably linked to its temporal and spatial attributes as a film made in America during the Great Depression, and what that means for filmmaking during times of economic and political unrest. Welcome to my video essay. This is All is Fair in Love and War, Class, Romance, and Depression-era Filmmaking in Gold Diggers of 1933. The film begins with its first musical number entitled We're in the Money. It's also important to note that this is where you see the pre-code production at its most obvious with the scandalous coin outfits. The title of the film being Gold Diggers of 1933 gives us an insight into how class plays a major role in the film as a whole. At the beginning of the film, we are given a kind of insight into how the Depression affects the girls in their lives. Their show gets canceled due to unpaid bills, the three of the main girls live all together, the landlady is asking for rent, and they steal milk from their neighbor's balcony. Their living situation and lives are juxtaposed to their neighbor Brad, who volunteers the money to fund their new and upcoming show that could bring in salaries for the girls. The juxtaposition between them is also expressed even clearer when Brad's brother and family lawyer visit to try and discover what he is doing and save him from being seduced by a gold digger. The film emphasizes the distinction between upper-class and lower-class individuals through their livelihoods within depression. There's also an interesting sentiment surrounding the showgirls and the kind of women they are. They are described by Brad's brother as gold diggers, as sleazy, and as women who will seduce you and lead you to your demise. But Brad doesn't see it that way. He's an upper-class individual that loves Polly for who she is. In his essay entitled Class Rise as a Reward for Disinterested Love, Cross-Class Romance Films, Stephen Sherritt says this, quote, "In a number of the social problem films of the transitional period, women escaped from starvation wages, grueling labor in sweatshops, and sexual harassment through romance and marriage with upper-class males. Brad's brother eventually has a change of heart, and all of the girls end up with wealthy men. The film plays out as somewhat of a fantasy for anyone, but especially women living through economic turmoil in a country ravished by depression." There is a specific scene in the film that comes to mind in relation to gender and romance and its clear connection to capital during this time. When Brad's brother and family lawyer come down to visit who they assume to be Polly, they are met by two of the showgirls and are let into their apartment. The two women proceed to somewhat seduce the two men while also deciding to take advantage when they've reeled them in. When the men are inside their apartment, two different delivery men come to drop off hats that the women have ordered, but when it comes to the payment, the girls put on a show until Brad's brother and family lawyer hand over the cash. Throughout the film, an interesting connection between romance and capital is made as the girls wine and dine with the men and somehow eventually fall in love with them. Stephen Sherritt, in his essay entitled Wealth and/or Love, Class and Gender in the Cross-Class Romance Films of the Great Depression, says this, quote, "The exchange of sex for mobility, material benefits, or sheer survival was made more prominent by the Depression. The bargaining of sexual favors for material benefits was recognized by contemporary observers as a far wider phenomenon than prostitution." Although the film isn't as explicit as exchanging sexual favors for material or financial items, it is clear that the catalysts for romance and marriage are not only love, but specifically financial stability and gain. During the Depression, women had even fewer ways to make a wage than their male counterparts. At the time, and even in our current day and age, it is somewhat of a dream fantasy to find and settle down with a partner who can financially take care of you, buy you extravagant clothes, and put food on the table. As you've probably assumed from my discussion of both class and romance so far, the Depression enhanced the two's links to one another and made both dependent on one another. It's also important to note that while the showgirls had jobs on Broadway, their career choice instantly placed them into their socio-cultural class level, as their jobs were not seen as honest work and their jobs were often reflected onto their character. Remember My Forgotten Man is both the final song and the final scene of the film. The song is quite jarring as it concludes the film but also addresses the Depression and the effect it had on the American people. When watching, I felt a huge shift in tone because the film is a comedy. It deals with the girls' lack of income and their problems in a comedic way. Not until this final song had Berkeley and Leroy given us an honest and non-comedic take on the effects of the Depression on the American people. One of the lines that I find most important in the song is this, quote, "Remember my forgotten man. You put a rifle in his hand. You sent him far away. You shouted hip hooray. But look at him today. Remember my forgotten man." End quote. The song is sung as kind of a remembrance to the men who fought in World War I, just to come back to the harsh realities of a depression, from the front lines to the breadlines. Not only is this a critique on the failings of the American government to protect and serve its people, it also gives us more insight into how gender functioned during the time. The song also points out the Depression's effects on the job market and the inability for most men to obtain and keep their jobs. It's insinuated that the natural way of life is for men to take care and provide for women, but the Depression had taken away that normalcy and the quote-unquote proper role of a man. It's clear that at the time, the Depression not only destroyed the livelihoods of the American people, but it also disrupted the classic gender roles and the proper American way of life, obviously affecting different economic classes disproportionately. To conclude my video essay, I'd like to talk about what theme I think connects a lot of films made during times of economic or political unrest, that being escapism. We see it in movements like German Expressionism that was born around the same time and was linked to the aftermath of World War I. In bigger or smaller ways, we see this escapism fantasy very interestingly in Gold Diggers of 1933. All cinema, especially during these times, is a form of escapism for audiences. But what is interesting about this escapism and its link to its temporal aura, per se, is that it is romance fantasy and capital/consumption fantasy. For a woman alive in the time of the Great Depression, there is no bigger fantasy and escape like the idea of a wealthy man waltzing into your life, sweeping you up off your feet, and being able to buy you every style of hat on the market. Not to insinuate that capitalism and romance were not closely linked before the Depression, but the everlasting effects of the Depression on capital and romance are still very much alive today. Gold Diggers of 1933 shows us not only the effects of the Depression on the American people and their values, but it shows us what the American people fantasized about, and how they had hoped America would come out like on the other side of it all.